Fujifilm team was kind enough to send me an X-T50 prior to its release. So for the past couple of weeks, I've gotten an opportunity to shoot a bunch of different things with this camera. And today I want to talk a little bit about some of my first thoughts after this use. Let's get into it. First things first, I do want to talk a little bit about the externals. I want to talk about the physical nature of the camera. Obviously, to start with, it offers that classic Fujifilm look that everybody knows and loves. Has the film-inspired dials throughout the top of the camera. And just in general, off the bat, I found it personally to be pretty comfortable in my hand. I do have smaller hands, and the camera is smaller, but just the way that it fits has a really nice grip. The Q button protrudes on the back here to get a nice place to kind of sink your thumb into when you're gripping the camera. And then on the front, we have an area to kind of place your fingers. So it's just a nice grip overall, especially for something this small. The viewfinder is set in the center of the camera. For me personally, I actually find that to be a preference with the other gear I use. For example, I'm usually using a Fuji X-T50 and it has a similar placement for the viewfinder. I'm not sure why I prefer having that center weighted viewfinder. I think for me, I just find it easier to hold in, different orientations while I'm actually using the viewfinder. So it might not be something that you like, but for me, it's pretty aligned with my personal preferences. Now, in terms of just like the size and weight of a camera, that doesn't generally matter to me all that much. I don't care if my camera is super light. However, I have smaller hands, so I will find that generally I align better with smaller cameras, which is something that I appreciated about this body. It's also really nice that this thing can kind of just fit right into, like a fanny pack or a sling pack or something like that. Just makes it a really good everyday carry. You've also got a pull-out screen, so if you wanted to shoot horizontal photo video from kind of like a waist level and looking down into the camera, that's something you can do. I wish there was a vertical orientation option of that where you could pull the screen out. My Fuji X-T3 has that feature, so I can do horizontal waist level video and photo. And if I wanted to go into a vertical crop, I could do vertical as well. That's not something present on the X-T50, but for me, not really a deal breaker, and I don't think it will be for you either. The last thing I want to talk about, and probably the most exciting addition to this camera from a physical perspective, is going to be the new film simulation dial here on the top left of the body. This dial allows you to essentially just control directly what simulation you're using on your photos when you're out shooting in the field. Right off the bat, the dial is already programmed to have a couple of the different simulations ready to go for you. And it also offers custom functions that you can set up so you can choose other simulations that you like, apply those to those custom functions, and have them ready whenever you want to switch the dial to those functions, which is kind of nice. I'll be honest, in most cases, I don't shoot JPEG. I pretty much only shoot RAW. But if you're somebody who enjoys the looks of the simulations, you're going to have a lot of fun playing around with this dial while you're out shooting. Now let's switch gears. I want to talk a little more about the actual internal specs of the camera. I want to preface this with the fact that I'm not a tech guy. I'm not a gear guy. I care much more about the experience I have when I'm using a new camera as opposed to really any type of spec. That said, there's a lot of really cool stuff packed into this camera, so I do think it's worth it for us to touch on those points, and it'll just give you a better sense of whether or not this is something you want to bring into your arsenal this year. The sensor inside this thing is astonishing. I mean, the resolution it's incredible. The amount of detail that you can pull from an image, how clean these images look. I was honestly pretty astonished by how high level this sensor really is. 40 megapixels is a lot. All that resolution does is really just make sure you're creating the cleanest image possible. Might not always be necessary, but for me, coming from the Fujifilm X-T3, obviously I'm seeing a huge difference in the quality of the images I'm taking. The X-T50 also delivers a new processor, and the difference is definitely noticeable. I mean, even things like just turning the camera on, turning the camera off, going through the menus inside the camera, these things are just a lot quicker. As somebody who shoots in a lot of environments that are relatively fast-paced, this is an important feature for me, and again, it's probably going to be a driving factor in me as I upgrade cameras in the next couple months or so. Out of all the features that I was impressed by from an internal specs perspective, the one that I am most impressed by is definitely the 7-stop IBIS that's baked into this camera. I was able to take this camera out at night at blue hour, and I was shooting shutter speeds handheld that were as low as like 1/10 of a second, maybe even lower. And I was getting no shake in the shots. They were all crisp. I was just completely blown away. I didn't really need a tripod for a lot of scenes that I normally would rely on a tripod to shoot. I was very impressed, and this is something that makes me realize I definitely need to upgrade from the X-T3. So that said, if you're somebody who shoots at night or wants to start shooting at night, but you don't necessarily want to lug around a giant tripod, this camera might be a really good option for you. As I kind of mentioned in the beginning of the video, I've had the camera for a couple of weeks and had the opportunity to shoot a couple different types of scenes. But my favorite use for this definitely is street photography. I'm actually going to upload a POV video of me shooting some street with this camera that I took recently, so you can expect that on the channel in the next couple of weeks. Now, with the camera being so small and compact, but still so fast and packing so much of a punch, I found it to be arguably the perfect everyday camera for carrying around the city or just going on quick adventures where you don't want to bring a ton of gear, you don't want to bring a super heavy setup. I think this thing is a great option for those scenarios. I found the autofocus to be very snappy, very responsive in street photography scenarios where you obviously have a ton of moving people and a ton of moving objects, and you want to make sure that you really nail that focus. I know I already mentioned this, but got to revisit the IBIS. I was still just so impressed by the fact that I could shoot at like 1/10, 1/8 of a second and still get a really crisp image, especially handheld. I mean, it's just not something I've ever been able to do before. My max typically is like 1/20th, maybe a little bit lower. So yeah, just really impressed with that aspect of the camera as well. One thing I also noticed as well is there was a lot less noise in a lot of the images, especially shot in low light. So that's something else to consider. The sensor is just a lot higher quality than what I'm personally used to. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Fujifilm X100VI, the infamous X100VI. I actually think that the X-T50 is arguably a perfect replacement for that camera. The X-T50 has essentially the same internals as the X100VI, but what you also get is the ability to swap lenses. So for me, as a photographer who shoots a bunch of different things, versatility is really important to me in my camera setup. So if that's you, this might be a better option than the X100 lineup. Definitely something to consider if you have a pre-order and you're waiting on the X100VI to come in. With that being said, guys, this pretty much wraps it up for me. If you feel like you learned something or got something out of this video, feel free to subscribe so I can see you in the next one. Take care.